On today's special edition of World Insight, fishing hamlet to a glittering tech hub, the transformation of the city of Shenzhen in 40 years of reform and opening up.
It's an example of how special economic zones can prosper. Now, China, I think, is the best example.
And so for Shenzhen to be focused on technology and try to lead a path towards the development of indigenous technology, I think is a very important component.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. We begin today's program in southern China's Shenzhen, as it's marking 40 years since it became a special economic zone, the spark of the nation's opening up. A tribute took place there on Wednesday with the Chinese president laying out his vision for the city. President Xi called on Shenzhen to keep contributing to the nation's journey to become a strong, modern socialist country. It was in 1978 that China decided to pursue reform and opening up. And 2 years later, the Shenzhen Special Economic Zone came into being, a magnet for direct foreign investment and cross-border trade. The bustling metropolis is at the heart of the tremendous changes in China over 4 decades. This once little fishing hamlet has become one of the most vibrant cities in the world. Now, with a population of 12 million, it is home to several big Chinese tech companies, including Huawei, Tencent, and ZTE. Bordering Hong Kong, it is part of China's Greater Bay Area Development Plan, which connects key cities in southern China. So, what makes Shenzhen so attractive, and what risks and opportunities lies ahead for this miracle city? Today, we invited a very strong panel who witnessed and took part in the city's growth. Let's talk to them. On the Shenzhen Special Economic Zone, its 40th anniversary, we are joined in Shenzhen, Haiwen, who is the Dean of the Peking University HSBC Business School. In Beijing, Fu Jun, the Academic Dean of the Institute for South-South Cooperation and Development of Peking University. In Washington, D.C., Yu Konghuang, Senior Associate in the Carnegie Asia Program, where his research focuses on China's economic development and its impact on Asia and global economy. Last but not least, Arthur Dong, Professor at Georgetown University, McDonald's School of Business. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Professor Haiwen, you are in Shenzhen, so help us to understand how people are reacting to the whole set of policies provided by the central government regarding Shenzhen's further reform and opening up.
I think the people are excited and also proud because we are proud of the past 40 years and achievements. At the same time, very encouraged by the central government now have given the Shenzhen more policy to reform and open up. I think this is a general reaction to this event.
Mr. Huang, you've been to Shenzhen in and out many times, and of course you're observing that from the other part of the Pacific. Tell me more about your reactions to 40 years of Shenzhen.
I think that the performance, the change in Shenzhen over 40 years is unparalleled. I don't think you have any kind of example elsewhere in the world where you go from small villages of 30, 40,000 people, 13 million, maybe 20 million if you include informal workers, and you have a third largest mega city in China today. So it's a major achievement over 40 years. It's an example of how special economic zones can prosper. And China, I think, is the best example. I think the big question here in the West, that comes from President Xi's trip, the highlighting of Shenzhen's performance, is what is going to be coming in the future. If you actually give Shenzhen more challenges, more responsibilities, how will policy shift in the coming decades compared to the past?
That's a very thought-provoking question. Professor Fu, you are in Beijing. Looking at Shenzhen from where you are, and certainly there has been a front line for China's reform and opening up. The question really is, will what Shenzhen learned can be really shared in the rest of the country?
Yes, now I am in Beijing, but every year I would travel to Shenzhen. So Shenzhen is not a place that's strange to me. It's very familiar to me. Well, the lessons we learn from Shenzhen, it's a sort of vanguard city moving ahead of the rest of China, is that you have to open up and you have to reform. Open up means you have sources of innovation. After all, to begin with, we start with a GDP per capita which is very low. When you compare that with advanced economies, we are much behind. So it's unquestionable, the sources of innovation that comes from outside. But with that, you need to reform domestically. That means the institutions. You need to adjust the role of state, just grow the role of market. And now, it's very interesting to point out, when you look at the society of Shenzhen, you look at the population of managing population, close to 20 million. Well, the bulk of that are migrant workers. So everyone is equal. And with that population of magnitude moving towards market, you have the explosion of energy in that area. Okay. And once that's a success, it stands as a model for the rest of China to follow. Now, what we call it a policy experiment. The key essence of that is you need to control a complexity of variables. And there you can control very precisely. You have to open up. You have to reform. And these are the key variables. And we are halfway between plan and the market. And the challenge for China is we need to continue in that trajectory of moving from a planned economy to a market economy.
Professor Dong, you're in D.C., but I know you are following China's development for some time already. Tell me more about reactions to Shenzhen 40 years.
Yeah, the overall reaction, certainly from observers such as my colleagues, who have actually witnessed, and I've witnessed, the growth of Shenzhen. My first trip to Shenzhen was in 1991, where I was involved in a joint venture enterprise. And the remarkable change that Shenzhen has transformed itself from, again, a tiny fishing village to a city close to 20 million people. It has always led in the vanguard of economic development for China and serves as a model and test bed for other cities to emulate. And what's the most remarkable thing of the most recent announcement by President Xi is that the reforms and further reforms that will be instituted in Shenzhen, this is generally a pattern that China follows. And most likely, if these reforms work out, that these reforms will be rolled out on a much more wider basis throughout some of the major cities in China. So I'm very encouraged by what I've heard, and certainly very encouraged by the prospects of China continuing its reform policies, as well as finding ways to create a more sustainable economic environment.
Let's talk about Shenzhen today and tomorrow, because the past achievements have been beautifully illustrated in many documentaries, and certainly in your first round of answers. Professor Hai, some of the most important policies, favorable policies, quote unquote, given by the central government towards Shenzhen now regarding land, talents, flow of technology, and also flow of money. Now, among them, what do you consider as the most important thing? Some suggest the land. What do you think?
I think the most crucial is the policy to the open up for the flow of the capital and the talent, people. I think of this because the land, of course, this is another issue. Shenzhen has limited land. But again, I think most important is the capital and human capital. That will be very important for the future development of Shenzhen.
Why would you say so?
Why? Because I think the new development will be based on the high technology and also modern service. So those maybe not need so much land, but I think the most important is the technology and also new business model. So that will be the the important resources for the future development. Yeah, because land is limited. Of course, we can, in this area actually, not much potential development of the land, but I think the most important is the new industry, so may not use much land. That's why I'm talking about the capital and the technology and also human capital is very important.
Okay. Professor Fu, what about your thoughts? Some suggest, Shenzhen has become such a metropolitan city, but the land has been very limited, and the price of land and therefore of living and also office headquarters will be extremely expensive. That's preventing the talents from settling down in Shenzhen and companies from setting up their headquarters there. What do you make of all of these policies regarding the four areas: land, talent, technology, money?
Of course, land, when you look at land of the Shenzhen city per se, it's limited. But I guess there are room for you to think of things to create a better synergy among Shenzhen, Hong Kong, Macau, and the neighboring areas. There you can squeeze out a further source of productivity. Labor, well, it's a mega city already, but the flow of labor is very important. Ultimately, of course, it's the human brain, and there we are talking about human capital. At the end of the day, it's productivity comes from human brain, innovation. And to do that well, we can talk about technology, the hardware, sort of the physical technology, but much more deeper and important, fundamental is the institutional technologies, where I mentioned that you have to see what's the best way to mix the role of the state, the role of market, and the role of society, and there you can better to encourage people to be more innovative, creative, and at the end of the day, this is the creative source, not only for Shenzhen, for everywhere in the world.
Professor Dong, of course, when we talk about technologies, Shenzhen today is growing in a very different circumstance compared to 40 years ago, 30 years ago, even 20 years ago. Now, with the so-called tech competition, if not war, between China and the United States, Shenzhen, a place where the biggest Chinese tech companies are based and headquartered, where do you think it is going? What is the best strategy for Shenzhen at this point?
China right now is at a particular cross in the road. Over the past year and a half, we've seen a deterioration in its trade relationship with the United States. And China is now focusing increasingly on internal development. In other words, trying to find ways in which to secure for itself a technological future whereby it becomes less dependent on many of those parts and components that go into components such as being made by companies like Huawei. And so for Shenzhen to be focused on technology and try to lead a path towards the development of indigenous technology and broadening its technological base, I think is a very important component of Chinese economy and economic growth moving forward.
Professor Hai, now, about the indigenous innovation, that has been quite a controversial topic between China and the United States, with Huawei being, in a way, limited in its way of innovation as a result of the U.S. ban on certain components to be used for Huawei. Where do you think the Chinese tech companies based in Shenzhen, their future is, particularly in the near term?
I'm not sure the temporary how they have to deal with. But in the long term, definitely the China and also Chinese companies should focus more to develop those key technology by themselves. I think there are two ways. One is the company itself, like Huawei. They actually invest a lot in R&D. So before, of course, they may more rely on the international supply of this, the chips. But now, based on those particular situation, I think they will invest more and also try to recruit more talent to develop those technology by themselves. But on the other hand, I think the next stage, Shenzhen, also the universities. Now we have more universities located in Shenzhen, and then we'll develop more those type of basic technology. So I think that's take time. However, that's two-way for the new development, the research. One is by company, and the other hand is by a lot of university and also research institutes.
There is quite disappointing policies, let's just say, coming from Washington regarding exchange and also cooperation, even among universities, China and the United States. Do you see that having an impact on Chinese universities' innovation capabilities, Professor Hai?
I think that in short run may have a negative impact. Of course, this it's kind of a sudden policy issued by United States government. But however, something like the university, in particular those kind of science, technology, engineering, definitely will get some like negative impact. I think in the long run, in the long term, now our talent, especially many of the professors now they are returned from the United States, and of course they also carry on those kind of advanced technology. So again, I will say in the long run, China will develop, will not affect too much.
I think you hit on an important point. You have this U.S.-China technology and trade war. So the flow of innovation, knowledge is likely to be constrained in the coming years. What can Shenzhen do about it? Well, one thing we know is it's been extraordinarily good and flexible in attracting talent within China. So here's a city of 10, 15, 20 million, all coming from various provinces, and they've made it the innovation center of China. What makes a city more innovative than others is the creativity and knowledge sharing, and that comes from people coming from other places coming together. That Shenzhen is very, very good at. You also raised the question earlier about land. What makes Shenzhen different from Beijing and Shanghai? Of these three mega cities, it's the only one actually where the density of the population has increased, because Shenzhen has less land available than Shanghai and Beijing. Shenzhen doesn't have that land, so there's an issue here. And by giving Shenzhen more ability to manage its land, I think that the central authorities also recognize that the land issue is also very, very important, because property prices are rising more in Shenzhen than elsewhere. How do you make sure that Shenzhen maintains its innovative strength? And I think this is a big question that the government has to deal with. The key to that is actually the flow of knowledge. And if being constrained from the U.S. side, how do you compensate for that? And I think that is the big issue, big question mark that has to be faced.
Professor Dong, I was reading some of the articles written by experts in the U.S. about China-U.S. relations, and some have been describing over the past 10 months about the U.S. approach towards China. And this is certainly also related to Shenzhen. That is, if you talk about China as an enemy, if you deal with China as an enemy, and then you're making China an enemy. And it's interesting how the policies towards Shenzhen, of course, I'm not sure it's not just the U.S. targeted, it's multifaceted, but you see an innovation center is very much encouraged, and there's enormous morale in China to making Shenzhen and some of the other places ever more innovative and probably even more indigenously innovative. It's a very interesting phenomenon we're seeing right now here in China, particularly regarding China-U.S. relations. Professor Dong.
Yes, Tian, that's a very interesting point you bring up, because certainly there's a lot of political currency right now in the United States to target China and to sort of, in a sense, demonize China and use it as a punching bag. And so that has become part of the political debate in an election year in the United States. Unfortunately, we have a president that elevates this type of rhetoric and elevates this kind of language, and thus spreading some popular notions that China is our main rival and that China's growth means that this is not going to be good for the United States. And so until we can sort of find a way to clear through this sort of perception, I have a fear that this momentum is going to continue, at least in the near term. And certainly for Shenzhen and the citizens of Shenzhen, they certainly are very focused on the next phase of their development, and certainly very focused on the need to grow homegrown technology.
Yeah.
And so it's the combination of these two. And as we notice as academics, that innovation is oftentimes a resultant of deprivation, and it usually doesn't come because of excess. It's usually when you're being deprived of something that the true wellspring of innovation starts to move forward. So in a sense, this could be, there could be a silver lining to this for China, and that they are being forced to look inwards, and that may be the catalyst for further homegrown, scientific development.
Mr. Huang?
Given a U.S.-China trade war, and the first thing we recognize that both sides suffer. When you cut off the flow of technology and knowledge between two countries, both countries are affected negatively. So China, I think, is rightly trying to deal with this by becoming more self-sufficient in key areas. And I think the Shenzhen example is why it's being designated as a special focal point. Because we don't actually know how to do this in terms of increasing the stock of innovative knowledge when you're being constrained in the midst of a global crisis. Bringing in down is one particular means. I think that the experimental nature of what's going on in Shenzhen is a big advantage. If you look at the three major companies in Shenzhen, whether it's Huawei, ZTE, Tencent, these are private companies which developed from nothing. So in some sense, if you go back 20, 30 years ago, you wouldn't have predicted what would have happened. And so in some sense, we're guessing about the future. And so I think the experimental nature of what the government is doing in Shenzhen, I think is a very important aspect of how China needs to cope with this problem.
You're watching World Insight, our special program on the 40th anniversary of China's Shenzhen Special Economic Zone. Stay with us and we'll come back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Today we are focusing our attention on the 40th anniversary of China's Shenzhen Special Economic Zone. And we're glad to be joined by a very strong panel. Hai Wen, Fu Jun, Yukong Huang, and Arthur Dong. Let me start the second part of our discussion by talking about China's reform and opening up. Mr. Huang, decades ago you were here representing the World Bank. You certainly witnessed a very special period of time here in China, a transformation time from being the backward economy to being the manufacturing center of the world. And now certainly China is at a very different stage compared to then. But how strong do you think, Mr. Huang, observing from afar, is still China's reform and opening up momentum?
I think this is an extraordinarily successful 40 years here in China. When I came here in '97, China was still struggling with the issue of joining WTO and whether it would become a successful exporting nation. Of course, that's what it was. So it very quickly became a manufacturing power. What we are facing today, and I think Shenzhen is a good example, is to move from export manufacturing to services, to innovation, to knowledge. And that's quite a different kind of phase. And this is, I think, what's important. When President Xi gave his speech in Shenzhen, the general theme, and this theme was broadcast throughout the West, was a very familiar theme, socialism with Chinese characteristics. It was emphasized many, many times. And what I'd like to get into is, what does that actually mean in terms of policies or the ongoing experimentation in Shenzhen? And I would point out that socialism with Chinese characteristics is a very unique concept. It's how do you actually merge market principles, market allocation of resources, in an economy where the state controls the ownership of most of the assets. And this was outlined in the third plenum policy statement, that the market should actually become better and more efficient allocating resources, but within the context of the state control of most of the resources. And I think this is what Shenzhen has been very, very good at, introducing market principles in a socialist kind of a system. And the issue now is not exporting manufacturing, is how do you translate that principle when you're moving to what I call a more innovative services-oriented economy. Mm-hmm. And I think the issue here, part of it, is information flows. And how do you merge state responsibilities and control of data and information with the market need for information, and then you move on to what I call the more innovative activities. And I think underpinning the general principle that President Xi outlined was this kind of issue and challenge for Shenzhen, mm-hmm. and they wanted to see how they could handle this.
Professor Fu, your thoughts?
Well, here a very striking point when academics in China talks about theory, they do not buy much about static theory. Their theory all tend to be dynamic. So socialism with the Chinese characteristics is a hallmark of a dynamic theory. Mm-hmm. We look at a country in terms of a stage of development. And as the stage continue to move forward, and you need to inject new elements into that. And early on, when we do opening up and reform, you see an early stage of industrialization. You see labor moving from the countryside gradually to the cities. And when you see a industrialization, labor intensive, capital intensive, then knowledge intensive. So for us to see China through the prism of Shenzhen is that for China to continue to reform itself, the focus is increasingly on the physical dimension of factors production to the non-physical part, that is human creativity, innovation.
40 years ago, when Shenzhen just started as a fishing village, once the favorable policy is being given or provided to Shenzhen, or at least, to do what you do, and then the central government do not necessarily involve too much, then everybody would work their way out, and they find the pragmatic ways of doing reform and opening up, starting from Shenzhen. But now, there are an extra layer of challenge, which is the renegotiation about what Shenzhen can do in terms of the government, the state, the market, and also the flow of information, as Mr. Huang earlier illustrated. So what about this new round of negotiation? How fast can it go? After all, Shenzhen is already very successful. If you look at the numbers, per capita GDP, 30,000 US already. That's quite a huge number. And therefore, that means vested interests, too. And that means there are certain confined ways already of doing things as time goes by. So this renegotiation, how much confidence do we have, Professor Fu?
Well, of course, we should be careful. When you reach a GDP per capita level in the neighborhood of 30,000, you tend to become complacent. But when you come with that level to a higher level, there are certainly rooms for you to improve further. And when you exhaust the physical part of the economy, natural capital, mm-hmm. Human capital, then it's innovation. And innovation has much to do with institutional technology as well. We tend to forget about that. When industrialization started, we tend to think of the trains, the engines, less we talk about factory as an institutional innovation.
Professor Haiwen, give us a more pragmatic answer because you're based in Shenzhen. I'm sure when you're talking to your friends and colleagues, people are already thinking, and they're thinking about this new round of negotiation.
People here actually have hope. Okay, should they give more open and more free the policy? Of course, China in Shenzhen actually will come, as Professor Fu said, will come to the new stage. It's not just the economic development, but also the other part of like social life quality, and also the governance of the city, etc. So, and also talk about the Greater Bay Area. That's another issue people are very interested in. How we can continue reform, have a more open policy, then we can have the joint development of not only Shenzhen and also the Hong Kong, Macau, Guangzhou, etc.
You talk about the Greater Bay Area. That certainly is one of the most interesting questions, which is not necessarily within Shenzhen's policymakers' power in a way. It has to incorporate all of the elements and the energy of this area. So it is more than just a reform and opening up issue. It's about how to incorporate and how to work together and how to even generate the energy coming from the central government in order to make the whole area work. So, Professor Hai, about that, it's certainly a much more complex question.
Yes, this actually is not just Shenzhen, and so therefore it's another big challenge for the central government, but also for Shenzhen government. And I think the most important is the system, economic system, because in this area we have three, even the monetary system we have three, and also there's a border between the mainland and to Hong Kong and Macau. So actually we talk about the Greater Bay Area, but again the challenge is how can unify those type of a system here. And if you unify the system in this area, then how to to make a difference between this area and also the rest of the area of China. So this is people talk about, but again, we don't have a bigger solution yet.
There are two areas. One is how Shenzhen could work with the Greater Bay Area, which would include Hong Kong, Macau, Zhuhai, and some of the other surrounding areas. And the other thing is how to renegotiate with the central government about the free flow of information and also about ideas, which is, of course, beyond the earlier testing and exploration.
Yes, certainly these are all very important points, because without a harmonization of the rules that govern this region will never reach its full potential. It certainly on paper has great potential as perhaps one of the greatest areas in terms of overall GDP. And if you were to sort of add up the GDP of Guangdong province with Shenzhen, we're talking about the GDP of a country such as Russia. And so on paper, the true economic potential has not been realized yet. The infrastructure has certainly been built, high-speed rail, super modern highways, airports, gleaming airports. So the infrastructure is there. You need a harmonization of rules now. And if you could harmonize these rules, streamline the rules governing finance, and certainly open up the flow of information, because ideally innovation is bottom up, not top down. And so you need more bottom up, approach to innovation. And to do that and to encourage that, you need the ability for people to communicate and share ideas openly.
It's not just about the hard infrastructure, it's certainly about the soft infrastructure, it seems you are trying to indicate. Mr. Huang, give me your thoughts.
You have inefficiencies whenever you have borders, whenever you have restrictions. So land use is a problem, because something can only influence and control a certain portion of land under its jurisdiction. But neighboring areas have land. And the question is, should you make that land more generally available in terms of being used and planned across boundaries? That's one big issue. So land is an issue in terms of borders. The movement of people is an issue. So I see that in the new proposals, there are suggestions that the mobility of people from Guangdong to Hong Kong should be further liberalized. You want to get to the point where people can actually travel back and forth relatively easily and efficiently without having to go through complicated immigration processes. So you need to liberalize the borders in terms of labor movement. You need to eliminate the border in terms of currency. Ultimately, I think, frankly, down the line, you're going to see the situation where the renminbi is going to be basically freely convertible. It's strengthening a great deal now. The capital markets are basically getting linked globally. More money is pouring into China. reserves are remaining very, very strong. So you're working toward that kind of a stage where restrictions in terms of land use, restrictions in the mobility of people, restrictions in the flow of capital, and then frankly, restrictions on the flow of information. That's what causes problems in terms of growth, innovation. And if this kind of Greater Bay development program deals with what I call the 4 restrictions, then I think you're going to have a dynamic region here.
Let's focus our last round of questions. That will be about how much what Shenzhen learned can be shared by the rest of China when it's dealing with its own growth and also when it's dealing with the relations with the rest of the world. Professor Fu, your thoughts?
Well, Shenzhen continued to move ahead when you look at its GDP per capita, and that is a good model for China. And for China, is even when you look at within China, we have areas where it's way ahead of others. So it is good for China to look at the success models and to scale up the rest of China. And for Shenzhen to continue to move ahead, you need to aim at global standards to scale up Shenzhen to that standards. And of course, as our friends have talked about, basically you need to look at 2 sets of things. One is the physical infrastructure. The other is the soft infrastructure, social infrastructure, institutional infrastructure, whatever word we use. It's sort of the invisible stuff. Now, for the first round, we look at what people would say the low-hanging fruits. It's easier to learn. You just have to be part of the process. The next round is the invisible stuff. Adam Smith incidentally talked about market as an institution. To me, all institutions are invisible, and there may be traps there. So we have to work very hard to overcome those difficult part of learning, because you are learning something that is not immediately visible in your naked eyes. And once you overcome that, you'll certainly see additional sets of creativity, innovation.
Professor Dong.
Yeah, certainly Shenzhen has always been a test bed of experimentation for China. And what works in Shenzhen, they have always, the central level, taken some of the things that have worked in Shenzhen and exported it to other cities around China, creating like-minded special economic zones. And so the history of that has been very successful. I will agree with Professor Fu that it's a combination of both the tangible as well as the intangible elements that go into the design of a successful city. And so now focusing on the intangible elements are going to be all important. In other words, human creativity, human talent, how will cities both embrace and encourage, and what combination of incentives will they provide to make sure that China's youth, their best and their brightest, reside in the cities where they live. And so I think for China, this is a great challenge, but with the proper combination of incentives, clear-minded policy, I think many of the experiments that are found in Shenzhen can be distributed further and wider within the Chinese landscape.
Is that the case, Professor Hai?
Well, some idea, theoretically, I think the Western area should learn from Shenzhen how to open up and also reform. But however, I think there are a lot of constraints, not just the theory, not only know how, but also we need the condition. For example, the culture. I think the Western, they need some kind of much more, even the government should be much more understand what is the market economy, and also the general education. Even they should access more information. The people too. It's not just to say, we have to learn from Shenzhen. So even they know the open up and also reform is important, but when they implement all those policies.
Finally, Mr. Huang, can what Shenzhen experienced and tested, explored, be shared by the rest of China?
And the answer, clearly based upon the past, is yes. In the World Bank, we calculated an index of what we call technology transfer absorption, the ability of a country to gain knowledge and experience from other countries and to use it effectively. And China is in a class by itself over the last 20 years. It's been able to absorb the knowledge and ideas from abroad, bring it back, and spread it across many companies faster than any country we've ever seen. And the key to that has always been, one, that information is shared within the system, the government supports it, and that there is mobility of people. Because the knowledge is transferred when people move from company to another company, from province to province. So the aspect of Shenzhen which makes it so successful is that everybody in Shenzhen came from somewhere else. So they have roots and links with all parts of China. And that's what makes Shenzhen a source of what I call knowledge transfer and innovation success transfer. And I think this is going to continue. So as long as Shenzhen is able to tap what I call expertise, whether it's at home or abroad, that knowledge then is disseminated within China. So I'm very confident about this aspect.
On that, I want to thank the four of you, gentlemen, for contributing to our discussion about Shenzhen 40 years back, and certainly looking forward to its future. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Hai Wen, Fu Jun, Yu Kong Huang, and Asher Dong. Thank you. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, you can certainly search World Insight. That's the name of our program, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.